Hey there, viewers, and welcome back to the Self-Made Auto Channel. That's a 2010 Buick. It's the Lucerne. It's got the big 3.9, and we're going to learn the importance of why we test and don't guess, because this one would have got you. I just want to use this car as a good example because this one would have burned you if you're just a code reading, part changing machine. Because we look at this, we got your classic PO101, PO102. They're both current. They're both pending, they're both permanent, so this has been an ongoing problem, and all signs point to a bad mass airflow. Has all the symptoms, run like crap, stalls at stop signs, sometimes it works good, sometimes it doesn't, and when you drive it, and you're actually looking at live data, when we're looking at mass airflow data, which I had here, it comes and goes. When we drive down the road, it'd be working fine, all of a sudden it drops out, comes back. You know, pretty classic, bad mass airflow symptoms. However, not wanting to get burned and not wanting to have to eat a several $100 mass airflow from the dealer, if you're dealing with mass airflows, or at least in our shop, we use OEM only. You put an aftermarket one on there, you'll have to buy 50 of them to get one that works. So prior to doing it, and just to do our due diligence, I wanted to make sure that the mass airflow sensor has all its correct inputs. I know this isn't really good, I just printed this out for my own sake. Our mass airflow here has an intake air temp sensor built into it. So that's this portion over here, which we're not going to deal with. It's just a 5-volt signal coming out of the PCM. It's our our intake air temp. We're looking at this over here. We have our ground for the mass airflow. We have the yellow wire, which is our signal wire, and then we have our pink and black wire, which runs from a 12-volt fuse. So we have a power, a ground, and a signal wire. On these mass airflows, they put out a frequency. I believe key on, engine off, they're like 300 to 500 hertz, and then when they're running at an idle, they're somewheres, around 2 to 2.5 kilohertz, and then the frequency increases as mass airflow increases. So I was going to take it for a drive because, like I mentioned, when I took it for a drive, I did notice that it would drop out and get all glitchy. So I hooked my scope to it and I was getting ready to take it for a drive, but I noticed the problem right off the bat. And this is what we're going to look at. So we look on the scope here, we have our battery positive is hooked to the red wire. All right, so which is what we should have. And we have, as you can see here, just tracing it across, 12 volts. So key on, engine off, we have 12 volts. The signal wire is our green trace on the screen. And you can see we don't have a frequency signal coming there. We were holding somewheres like, we're holding somewheres around 8 volts. Let me get this back up here. Let's see. Close enough. So we're holding somewheres around 8 volts there. But here's where it gets interesting. Our blue wire, I hooked to our ground. Now we're measuring from the ground to the ground. We all know our basic voltage drop. What should that reading be? That should be 0. And this is why I never use the sensor ground for my scope ground when I'm checking a sensor. And I typically will always put one scope lead on the sensor ground, because if it's bad, you're gonna see this. It's gonna be elevated like that. So I hope this makes sense. Red wire, 12 volts, battery. Green wire hooked to the signal coming out of the mass airflow. We know how these work. We know we should see like a 300 to 500 hertz signal coming out of it. And our blue wire is hooked to ground, and that should be at 0. So let that be a lesson to you. I grabbed us a jump wire, stuck it right here in my pocket because I wanted to do this. Once I seen what was going on today, the people might want to see this. Could get interesting. So I'm going to piggyback right into the back of this banana jack. And if we stick this up here, in a perfect world, oh bingo bango, in a perfect world, our mass airflow starts working. And it does. Let me get my pointing apparatus. Look what happened to our ground, our blue wire here. That went back down to 0 volts, okay? So that's good. We put our ground back to 0. And then we have our 0 to 5 volt frequency signal coming out of the mass airflow sensor. So that's pretty cool. I don't know where this ground is located. It's interesting to me because when I was driving the car, it worked. Most of the time I would, couldn't find any rhyme or reason. It's just all of a sudden I would lose mass airflow signal. So let's look on a diagram and see if we can trace this out. I hope it makes sense as to why I utilize, when you're using your scope and you're checking a sensor, to use, ideally, the battery negative would be the best thing to use, but the battery's in the trunk on this car, I think. Yeah, it is. I looked for a minute, make sure it's not hiding here. So, I utilize, chassis ground. However, if we had our scope ground in the sensor ground, it could be misleading, because our battery voltage now shows that it's around a little over 4 volts. So you're looking at this like, of course our blue lead's not being used at this point because we wouldn't be using that. But we look at it, because now we're just checking signal and power. Well, our signal's sitting here below ground slightly, and our battery voltage is only 4 point whatever volts, 4.2 volts, something like that maybe. I can tell you it's sitting at 4.5 volts. So 4.5 volts is where our voltage, appears to be sitting when we're utilizing the sensor ground. That could send a guy in a wild goose chase, because if you just took this measurement saying, hey, I'm going to measure power and ground at my sensor, and you're just measuring across the two, and you're like, oh gosh, if you didn't know any better, I'm not trying to insult anybody, but if you didn't know any better and you saw 4.5 volts there, and you're like, what the world? Must be, I've got a power loss problem. Now you go in a diagram, you go to the fuse, you check your fuse, you're like, oh gosh, I've got 12 volts here. If you didn't do a voltage drop test on that power side, it's really gonna screw you. Or if you didn't come back and say, why is my voltage low? Do we have loss on the power side or the ground side? That's where you would get burned. So I hope that makes sense. I'm not the best teacher at explaining this stuff, but I just want you guys to know that you definitely have to be aware of this. All right, and utilize a separate ground when you're testing sensors and sensor grounds and sensor powers. Otherwise, stuff like this can get overlooked. We would never see that blue trace. Our ground is sitting at 8 volts. All right, and that's because it's corroded. If it was completely open circuited, it would be sitting at 12 volts. But clearly we can apply a ground to it and completely fix our problem. Okay, we've beat the horse enough. Let's find where that ground is, and hopefully it's easy and accessible, and we can trace it down, and hopefully the problem's right at the eyelet, and hopefully we don't have to get dirty. So there it is. That was the bad eyelet. You can't see it. Well, there's supposed to be 3 wires in there, but there's only 2, and it went and pulled out. Pull out, baby. I did. And as soon as I unhooked it, I saw the broken wire. I went ahead, got us the crimpers, crimped on a new number 8 5/16. Wait for it to cool. After I crimped it in good OEM fashion, I also soldered it, and that's solder with an L. The OEM ones here are crimped and soldered, if you will. So that's how the OEM does it. These two, despite being green, are still attached quite well. I give them a lot of yanks and a lot of tugs. I had to take the speed sensor harness off for that left front wheel. This one here, I just put a piece of heat shrink over it. And when I'm done crimping and soldering, I'm just going to shrink down the shrinky dink. We're going to slide these bad boys back in there. I'm going to think long and hard about replacing those other ones that don't have an issue right now. See what we want to do. We crimp it nice, because we crimp it twice. Decided to do the other ones. May as well, we're not going to be any closer. Got a good crimp on that. We're going to solder it and heat shrink it. 3-to-1 shrink ratio on this stuff with adhesive. Alright, let her cool down. I'll pull back the that cloth covering that they have on it. I'll wrap that up with some tape. Get this rerouted. Repairs are made. Ended up doing all 3 of them. Let's see if we can see down there. So they're all copper now. They're all soldered heat shrink. Put the factory tape back on them. We've got our mass airflow back in. Plug back in. We'll reach in here. Fire this guy up. I'm gonna fire this back up. Customer, I'm a little hectic this afternoon. Gotta clear his engine light there. Oh, that's what I was gonna look at here. Show you guys. So key on engine off. Known good. About 650 hertz at an idle, or key on engine off. I think that around 2,000, 2,500 or so. Let the idle come back down here. Right now we're about 3,000 hertz. I think they're usually somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 at an idle on a known good. Or nothing. Why did you quit reading frequency on me, little guy? Change our time basis here. Sometimes that'll make it read a little better. So yeah, about 2.7, 2.8 kilohertz. And we raise it up to about 2,500 RPMs, or about 4,500 kilohertz, give or take. So that's about 2,500 RPMs right there. So there's that. Woo, hallelujah. Let me go erase his codes here for him. It's friggin' scorcher today, dude. The weather's been so brutal, man. It's August, first week of August. Man, it's been just absolutely savage. We're not used to this, us New Yorkers. It's been awful. At any rate, I didn't make this video to show how to diagnose the Buick Lucerne. I initially started out with just the process of not guessing, of taking your time to take a test, and particularly a little bit about where to hook your ground on when you're doing sensor testing, and not to utilize the sensor ground to test it, but don't use it for your grounding point, because if that point is screwed, all the rest of your tests are going to be screwed. So utilize the best ground on the car, which is typically the battery. And then we'll say it again, don't go through and just start cleaning ground. So you're going to waste time. Follow the facts, folks. Get the data, follow the data. And don't trust service data. Gibbs rule number 47, don't trust service data. I don't know if that's his real rule, but that's my rule. Don't trust service data, never trust your scan tool. Even if it's OEM, it can still be bunk. So that's it. I don't know what else to tell you. Hopefully this video fits together somewhat good, and you guys can get a little something out of it. Questions, comments, concerns, put them in that comment box, folks. Find us on Insta, the Facebook, and just remember, viewers, if I can do it, you can do it. Thanks for watching.